So, hello and welcome to the latest Cornwall Insight podcast. My name is James Brabben. I head up our wholesale team here at Cornwall Insight, and I'm joined today by my colleague Andrew Enzor. Andrew, hi.
Hi, James.
How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. Pleased to be talking to you this afternoon.
Good. And Andrew, if you could just give a quick overview of what you do at Cornwall as well, because that will be really useful for what we're talking about today around network charging and TNUoS.
Yeah, of course. So my name's Andrew Enzor. I'm a senior consultant at Cornwall Insight, working in our consulting team, where we do anything and everything that our clients ask in the energy space. My focus particularly is on networks and rather geekily on network charging specifically, which is one of my favourite subjects, hence why we're talking about transmission charging this afternoon. I have a background in distribution network charging as well. I previously worked at Northern Power Grid, the DNO up here in the northeast. Pleased to bring that along to this conversation this afternoon. And hopefully we're going to have an interesting chat about TNUoS for the next 20 minutes or so.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, and as we say, we'll be discussing that kind of what it is, what does it mean for people in the market, what's so interesting about it right now, especially as we go ahead with a couple of big auctions coming up this year for the capacity market and the contracts for different scheme, and what might the future hold for TNUoS as well. So, Andrew, my first question, I realise we've gone into acronyms already with TNUoS, but TNUoS, what is it, and what's an overview of it, and what does it mean for people in the market?
Yeah, sure. So I'll do my best not to use their acronyms too much. TNUoS, we're talking about transmission network use of system charges. These are the charges that are levied by National Grid in its role as electricity system operator. In that role as the ESO, it levies TNUoS charges to recover both its own costs and the cost of all of the transmission owners, so the three onshore transmission owners and offshore transmission owners as well. It levies those costs on two main groups. So it levies costs in respect of demand users on suppliers, and also levies charges direct on large generators. So we're talking typically about generators connected to the transmission system, those above about 100 megawatts. And it's that we're going to focus on today specifically. We're going to talk about generator TNUoS, because some quite interesting things going on in that space. So generators pay a capacity charge for their transmission entry capacity. So it's a pounds per kilowatt charge, which is levied. So it's effectively a fixed cost. It doesn't vary through the year or anything. There's no kind of time of use signal or anything in there like we see in some of the distribution charges. A fixed pounds per kilowatt cost. It varies by generator type. So we have generators split into intermittent and controllable, and low carbon and carbon emitting generators. And we also have generators split into zones, so the charge varies locationally as well. So there's currently 27 zones across GB, with a fair number of those in Scotland, and then some larger zones in England as well, which we'll talk about a bit more in a while.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I think that's one of the interesting things about generator TNUoS, as it were, is that we do see, especially when you compare it to other network charges for generators and other network charges for supply customers or suppliers as well, that regional variation and the number of regions actually as well, with the 27 that we have currently, creates some quite big impacts depending on which type of generator you are and where you are, I suppose, as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So one of the interesting ones I always think that's probably worth bringing out for the audience as well is the geographical factor with probably north and south. So a good example I think maybe we can pick out is Scottish example with wind perhaps being a typical technology there, especially in the north. Is there anything we can kind of bring out around that of what's so interesting in Scotland with that kind of locational element? Yeah,
so I guess maybe just to take a step back first and talk about how that locational variation is derived. So, and the reason why we have this result with the charge for Scottish wind in this example being relatively high. The charge is derived based on effectively the distance that a megawatt needs to flow to get to demand. So where we're looking at generators in the north of Scotland, they're typically a long way from demand, whether that be the kind of nearest demand base being maybe the central belt of Scotland, but also typically we're seeing large volumes of power flowing north to south across the Cheviot boundary, effectively across the Scotland-England border, to get to demand centres in the Midlands and the southeast of England. So what we see with generators TNUoS, taking that wind example, James, is that we see In the southeast, we would actually see a negative charge for that type of generator, so they would be being paid an annual credit for being connected to the system. Effectively, that's reflecting that the power that they put onto the system in the south doesn't need to come across that constrained north-south boundary. Conversely, when we're seeing generators connecting in Scotland, and particularly in the far north of Scotland, we see the inverse of that, the power flowing onto the system there has to go over a long distance to get to demand. So we see much higher charges in those regions, particularly if we're looking at the kind of the very north of Scotland, we'll be looking at orders of magnitude above those for generators. Even further south in Scotland, there's really quite a stark differential kind of step up when we get to the far north of Scotland, where unfortunately the wind resources are very good. So there's a bit of a kind of interplay there to get the best wind resources and lower network costs.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point, Andrew, because I know we've done lots of work in this area as well. Is that effectively we have this kind of, I wouldn't call it a paradox, but almost the case where the network charging incentives, as you say, and you can see why they're aligned in that way, which effectively give a locational signal that the closer you are to demand as a generator, the lower your charges will be. So perhaps, a potential and incentive commercially for people to say I should locate closer to demand. But on the other hand, as you say, you've got certainly the best wind resources by wind speeds and load factors, potentially better planning aspects in Scotland where there's still an ability to source the planning permission for those sites, and land costs and those kind of things that come into it, and a bigger history of wind development that mean even though those costs are high, we're still seeing lots of people wanting to build their assets in those locations almost in spite of those charges in a way. And I think you said with the extreme examples in the north, probably even more extreme is those kind of remote island wind projects as well, isn't it, that are locating in the real northern parts of Scotland that are trying to connect as well.
Yeah, absolutely, and they face this even kind of stronger locational signal in terms of the cables that are needed to connect them to the mainland system. They effectively pay the sole payer towards those cables. So where there's significant lengths of subsea links between those remote islands and between offshore generators and the mainland transmission system, there's kind of an extra add-on to the strong locational signal for being in the north of Scotland, that you've then got that extra asset beyond the main system that you're required to make hefty contributions to.
Yeah, exactly. And I think just with my kind of hat on with the work we do around the CFD and those areas as well for people in the market, that's a really interesting one that we're tracking for that market at the moment too. So one of the key ones there really is typically the cheapest technology is likely to be some sort of onshore wind farm being the one of the cheapest technologies to go into that auction, especially in pot one that they're going to be in, competing with probably mostly with solar technologies. But actually, when you start adding these layers of different costs and benefits on, and TNUoS really being the big one, it starts to really change that dynamic potentially in the auction around, let's say a 100 megawatt scale solar farm versus a 100 megawatt scale onshore wind farm, likely being the onshore wind farm in the north of Scotland, paying a relatively high charge, as you say, Andrew, for those network aspects throughout the life of their asset for every kilowatt that they need as their grid connection, and having to price that into their CFD bid. And against that, you've got potentially a similar sized project, a solar farm, which is probably likely to be located further south. And if it's really far south, is actually probably getting a credit, isn't it, for being on the transmission system in its location? Yes,
a really interesting dynamic that we see there, and perhaps see increasingly with TNUoS perhaps becoming even more dominant in future CFDs than it has to date. I know you've got your finger on the pulse on these things, James, and we had the Crown Estate leasing round just released on us. Anything that you spotted in there?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one as well. Very, very topical, as you say, because it's the next Crown Estate leasing round where we're seeing, I think, about 8 gigawatts of offshore wind prospective capacity, essentially put down deposits is the simplest way I could describe it, of seabed leases. They pay a kind of deposit fee until they get their planning permission. hopefully for those sites, that then they can start the process of going into future CFD rounds. The round was for Crown Estate England. There's a separate ScotWind leasing round going on currently. They're done separately. But there has been quite a lot of talk in the industry actually about the scale of the price in England, or the high prices that some of these developers have been willing to pay to secure those rights, and whether we'll see a similar thing in Scotland. And actually, one of the interesting things you have to marry up to compare those two bids, as it were, it is TNUoS, because an offshore wind farm, let's say in the Forth of Firth, or where some of the projects are like Moray or Seagreen are good examples, will be facing a lot higher network charging costs throughout their lifetime, as it were, under TNUoS than those located off Dogger Bank or East Anglia Array, as an example. So that feeds its way all the way back into some of those prospective bids for future projects. Is every generator will be thinking about, once I'm on the system, what are my revenues, obviously under the CFD or other things, but really what are my costs as well? And TNUoS really seems to be rising up the agenda as the big one that most people have to factor into their behaviour really in the market.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting, particularly in those leasing rounds, that we're looking at generator connections that are a long way in the future, and that are already pricing in this TNUoS variability.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the key things I was probably going to ask you another question on, actually, Andrew, was how people do try and price that in, because realistically at the moment we have obviously TNUoS charges that are set for a year, and then obviously have a 5-year forecast from National Grid that comes with that to give people a view. But on top of that, there's a lot of other things going on and changing all the time with TNUoS and modifications. So what does the future look like at the moment for TNUoS charging?
Yeah, that's a really good question, James. And you're right to flag that there is a lot of uncertainty right now. So we just, within the past fortnight or so, had the final charges that will apply from April 2021 have been published. So that's the kind of notice window that we get. It's about 2 months for the final charges being released. In the run up to that publication, there was a whole raft of uncertainty with modifications going through the connection and use of system code, the CUSC modification process, so that the CUSC governs how TNUoS charges are set. It effectively tells the ESO what calculation method it has to follow to derive TNUoS charges. And being under open governance, any party to the CUSC can raise a modification and see it be progressed, and potentially by a work group, and then potentially a decision by Offshore as well. So we've seen a number of really high profile modifications going through in the run up to that 2021 publication, most notably on the transmission generator residual, which has been under review for some time, and was decided upon under Ofgem's targeted charging review that should be set to zero ideally, or at least reduced as far as it can be, subject to remaining compliant with regulations that set a cap on the total generated TNUoS charges. So we've had that uncertainty going through, and that's by no means the end of it. So we're looking ahead at the next 2 or 3 years with significant uncertainty, regulatory uncertainty in there, with modifications to some quite techie things, which I won't go into in too much detail, but things like the expansion constant, which effectively sets how strong the locational signal is. So if we increase that expansion constant, we strengthen the locational signal, so have higher charges in Scotland and higher credits in the southeast of England. That's under review. We expect there's a modification already running, and we expect more to come in that area. We've just had the price controls, which has been remiss not to mention to now. Really, we've got Rio T2 starting in 2021, which sets the allowed revenues that the network companies are allowed to recover. So at least some kind of consistency there over the next 5 years, that we've got a good view on that. Albeit compared to previous price controls, we have less certainty. There are more reopeners in those price controls, so they could be revisited at a later date to enable the network companies to react to changes in the way the system's used over the next 5 years. And then we've also got besides those kind of regulatory uncertainties, we've got the fundamentals of the system changing in terms of, we've spoken already at length about developments of both offshore and onshore wind. You mentioned solar as well, James, where we're seeing the location of generators on the system relative to one another and relative to demand changing quite fundamentally over the next let's say out to 2050 really, but over the next 10 years particularly we expect to see really quite a significant shift in the balance of the location of generation compared to demand. So not only have we got the regulatory uncertainty that I've spoken through, but also those all those impacts of where generators are connected relative to demand impacts that locational signal, which is calculated in the underlying TNUoS charge calculation. So a lot of uncertainty there, which the ESO gives us some help on with a 5-year forecast, but as we've already spoken about with these generators, looking at leasing rounds, for example, need to look well beyond that.
Yeah, I think that's a really critical point, isn't it, Andrew? That not only have you got the regulatory changes, which at least you have some foresight of when they might be implemented or if they might be implemented, it's actually such a dynamic element that if a demand base changed or if new generators connect to the system, especially if they're very sizable, then it's all one interconnected system in a sense, or formula that works out this charge and where the flow of electricity is expected to go, that then influences the total pricing spread to everybody else. So as you say, over the next 10 years, some good examples are, the closure of coal and some nuclear stations that will change the balance of where the power flows go up from those assets, notably many in the kind of North Midlands and Southwest. And then on the other hand, you've got a rapid rise in interconnection connections that are expected to come through in the 2020s. Again, most of those connecting to the south and east, which depending on how National Grid models the flows could either be sources of power coming in or sources of demand if we're exporting to the continent, which again changes the dynamic, doesn't it, of who should be paying and how they should be paying this charge.
Yeah, and really significantly as well, I don't think we should underestimate the kind of extent that that new generators coming on and old generators going off has on that locational signal.
Yeah, and I nearly forgot to mention offshore wind. We've already mentioned them already, but all those offshore connections coming through as well, we can't forget those. Yeah, so lots of change. And I suppose one kind of final question for me on that is how are we helping people through that at the moment? I know it's one of the big areas we work on and we get asked about a lot. It's something, as you say, that we definitely geek out on, but it's something that's very important to people. So what's the kind of work we've been doing people to help them understand this?
Yeah, so we've been doing some work for a while, helping people with the regulatory uncertainty. We do some pretty in-depth analysis of those modifications that I spoke about, and many more. So we have a tool that we will use with our customers to help them estimate the impact of those modifications going forward. But reacting to this need for longer term forecasts as well, we're just releasing our own 15-year view of TNUoS. So we've effectively taken the requirements of the CUSC, of the Connection and Use of System Code that governs TNUoS, and implemented that over a 15-year time horizon using the generation mix and demand mix from our power market model, our benchmark power curve. So we can give that long-term view, taking into account both regulatory and underlying changes in power flows across the system, which we can use to give forecasts of TNUoS GB wide, and so we can look at all zones for a given technology, and we can also look on a site by site basis to give bespoke analysis of the direction of TNUoS on a year by year basis out for that 15-year time horizon, taking into account the likely outcomes of ongoing modifications, but also giving customers tools that then mean that they can model different outcomes for those modifications, so that tool kind of remains live and remains up to date over potentially a relatively long period of time, that the parameters can be tweaked and the forecast recalculated.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew, because I think that's, as you say, one of the really interesting things is, of course, it's always changing. And if we do this podcast in a year's time, I'm sure our forecast will be tweaked and changed to account for the fact that we've got different generators coming on or off. There's been more modifications coming through the system, or the ones that we've talked about have either been implemented or approved or rejected by Ofgem as well. So it's a real moving feast, isn't it, in terms of activity here.
It is, yeah, but I think where we're quite well placed to help there is from a couple of angles. Really, we have our teams are always keeping an eye on those regulations and what's going on a day-to-day basis. So I attend the CUSC panel meetings, for example, so get some live information there, and the market monitoring as well, and forecasting that the team do through the benchmark power curve really gives us that long-term view to be able to make good judgments on which generators will connect where over that time horizon, so give a robust forecast.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andrew. Well, thank you very much for joining me today and talking about TNUoS. We hope it's been helpful for everybody in understanding what it is, why it's so important for a lot of people in the market, and of course, as always with energy topics, how it's changing in the future. Just to say, if you are interested in talking about TNUoS further, we of course have got the bespoke work that Andrew and others in our team work on, and our 15-year newly launched TNUoS forecast if you do want to talk about that. So please do get in touch for details to discuss that or anything related to network charging. As Andrew says, we're always looking at it on the pulse of it and studying the detail for our customers and clients. So we hope you enjoyed the podcast today. Thanks for joining me again, Andrew.
Thanks, James. Pleasure.
And thank you very much for everybody listening. We hope to speak to you again soon. Thank you very much.